So Marcy Syms, first of all, thank you very much for being here and welcome to the Conversation Factory. That's
It's
our,
nice to be here. Good
I
to see
appreciate
you,
you saying that.
Daniel. Yeah.
So I think it's an important place to start, just for the record, that my mother and I were educated consumers and we were your best customers. And I just want to go on record as saying I've spent many happy hours in Paramus,
Oh,
and I still have a blue wool shawl collar Italian tuxedo. It was the
oh,
strangest, it's one of these finds that you would only find at Sims. You're like, a blue, like, shawl collar, with fabric covered buttons, tuxedo. Yes, like 100 times. I still have a sulka tie in my closet. I know that was a,
hey,
so
Salka.
I just want to give a shout out. I don't know if everyone knows their retail history, but to me, I just, it's important for me to go on record, and when my mother listens to this episode, which she will, that we're fanboys and fangirls of, I think also your story is a quintessential American story. It's a quintessential Jewish immigrant story.
Yes.
um I grew up seeing you on television, but I honestly, times have changed, and not many people will know the name Sims, which is, as we say, I think, Ashonda. So I think it's really important. And it's also really clear that you have a lot of respect and admiration for your dad and wanted to share his story in your book.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to start with, like, what you most admire about him and what you want the world to know and remember about your dad and the work you two did together.
This book was started because I wanted people to remember his life story and to understand him within the context of that first generation American entrepreneur who had the kick upstairs from the GI Bill, was able to get not only an education at NYU, but also a first mortgage at 1.25% or something with the GI Bill,
Wow.
and basically able to get, as so many white males did in our country at that time, the opportunity to become one of the most successful generations in the history of the world.
Yeah.
They really changed the world. What I respected, I think, about my dad was his work ethic, first and foremost, that there was no time limit on getting a job done, that if he believed in something, there was a way to get it done. And if there were obstacles along the way, it was just a matter of not finding yet the right solution. And that can do attitude is what I most admired in my dad. And many of the entrepreneurs that lived in Yonkers as neighbors to us, who also had entrepreneurial verve and became, like 2 blocks away, lived one of the founders of the Young Presidents Organization. And that was something that engaged so many from that generation in a way of sharing business experiencing, networks, opportunities. They were creating a new world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's extraordinary, and it was a moment in history, as you say. Like,
Totally.
it's not necessarily clear that we can repeat it, but the
Well,
principles that, yeah.
yeah, I don't think we can exactly, but certainly from the standpoint of understanding the contribution that policy and government can play in structuring change of people's opportunity and realities. If
Yeah.
there's a political will, there is a way to go about trying to get to something like that.
Yeah. One of the things that I found really interesting about your book, I mean, you've been a witness to so much history. There's one chapter where you talked about 90s management theory, like being a decade bracketed by, what was it, the leadership secrets of Attila the Hun,
Yeah.
and in 1990, and Good to Great in 2001, and this, I don't know, kind of like ground shift, like a real change in perspective from, a top down, command and control leadership
Yes.
to a servant leadership approach. And I know that, you've written this whole book about leading with respect and you care about servant-based leadership, which I think, is one way to reframe leading with respect. Like, one, like, yeah, how did you evolve your own leadership mindset? Because in a way, you sort of cut your teeth in one world and then you
Yes.
evolved in another.
Yes. By observation, trial and error, listening to people, understanding group dynamics, seeing what was successful. Things really collapse when everything comes from the top.
Yeah.
There's no there. There's no fiber around the processes. There's no buy-in when something gets rough. One of the things that was interesting in being a non-Sims board member in other companies was what I learned at Sims about being a board member, that it only really counts when things get tough.
Mm.
When things are good and every quarter you're up 2%, 3%, or whatever it is, there's an opportunity there to do nothing, to sit back and do nothing.
Mm.
And so there's no question about how's the leadership doing. It's when things get rough. It's when there's a quarter that misses. It's when there's a disruptor in your sector. It's if you have a Sims that enters your part of the business. We were disruptors. We disrupted a supply chain. We created, in many respects, a different kind of business model for cutting out the middleman in a unique way for people who are buying clothing.
Yeah.
There was another disruption years later in the 90s with factory outlet stores. And then after 2000 and into the mid noughts with buying online. But there was disruptors in terms of the vertical retailers like H&M or
Mm.
earlier on Benetton or all that. Now, each of those entities, as they created their own markets, experimented with top down or bottom up,
Mm.
right? I believe that the top has to have a vision. I believe that the larger picture has to be seen by those at the top, and they have to create the language, the opportunity, the environment, and the culture that allows the bottom up to create the infrastructure,
Mm.
to create the process, to make the process sustainable. That's not a top down.
Yeah.
Sustainability is a bottom up.
Yeah. One of the things that I've always said is that the people who are the front lines of your organization are the people who just know the most about what's actually happening. And so you have
Totally.
to use this design principle that we're highlighting here, respect, or to respect what they are, what they know, what they are seeing, and what they're saying as true
One of the
because they're
things,
there.
yeah, one of the things we realized early on, and I remember when I joined the company back in 1978, and we had a plan for growth and how we were going to grow. But one of the things my dad said to me that I will never forget, he said, the hardest thing I ever did
Mm.
was to get from behind the register and open a second store because that required training and trust. And in observing him, the only way that he could actually achieve that kind of training and trust was to respect the person he chose to stand behind that register. And we used to say whenever we opened a new store that that manager and that management team for that community became Sims to those customers. They weren't seeing us every day.
Mm.
They were seeing the manager who lived in Pittsburgh or Houston or Miami, and they saw that manager as Mr. or Ms. Sims. So
Yeah.
if we don't speak and respect those people, they're not going to respect the customers, and you won't have anything. You'll turn around, and what you have is a bunch of people whose word of mouth is not working for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned there's a lot of things to unpack there. One, you talked about YPO, and I want to talk about your experience with forums and the ways in which they worked for you and didn't work for you. But you also, I know, talk a lot about boards.
Yes.
You and I get the sense that in general most boards are run poorly. And group dynamics is one of my, when we talk about designing conversations well, I assume that you have some insight that there are good practices and approaches and techniques and methods and skills around managing group dynamics in the
Yes.
context of a board, and less good ones that produce lesser results. And I'm curious how you coach leaders and audiences to think about managing those dynamics well, because obviously boards are the backbone of many companies, and I don't think they're providing as much value as they could be.
Right, right. Well, I think they don't provide as much value as they could because I don't think they really understand that there's so much that you can do as a member of the board, because your sphere of influence is every member on the board if you want to take that responsibility. I mean, in point of fact, there's an experience that I had where we had gone through this possible merger. Not when I was on the Syms board, it was another board. And uh, because the merger wasn't successful, there were activist shareholders and there were analysts out in the press that wanted the CEO to retire, to leave, to be fired, basically. And I thought that was a terrible idea. This was a hugely successful CEO. The deal didn't work, but he was incredibly respected within the company, within the industry, and was a real ideas man who the board respected. So we created a committee to analyze what went wrong and to make suggestions. Now, if there had not been agreement to do that committee, there would have been a knee-jerk response because of the pressure to start a search for a new CEO. And having that kind of response often from a board is what you see more than not, because they're very sensitive. I'm talking about public boards. I'm not
Sure.
talking about private or family businesses, which is a very, very different dynamic. I think that number one, you have to have complete transparency about the governance of the board. As a director, you need to know what are the rules that you're operating under. That's really very important. Is there a lead director? What is the communications between top management in the company and the board? How much exposure do you get to the other members of the C-suite? That's very important. Understanding mission and understanding goals. There are short term and long term. How do you check in on those? How do you know who's, as we used to say, rowing in the same direction and those that are starting to row in a different direction and holding you back? And so boards need to know how to check in on both the short term and the long term progress of the visionary goals that are being set. Oftentimes, the metrics of more specific, more numerical goals, more, sales up 5%. Well, your sales could be up 5%. And you know what? In the next year, someone else moves into your part of the market and whacks you and you're down 10, right? So
Yeah.
there's short term, there's the ability to be resilient. How does a board feel resilient? Mostly, I believe, by looking around the table and seeing that everyone in that room is there for a reason. Everyone in that room has a skill to bring to the table that can enhance the outcome of any situation.
It's interesting because I hear you talking about transparency, the importance of transparency, short versus long-term thinking. Obviously, the long-term thinking is in less abundant supply, I find. And this third thing, which you started with, which was reacting versus responding. It seems like maybe this is
Yeah.
just a human uh, instinct to react strongly versus to say, well, let's look around and let's take the global picture. I also hear you talk about influence, and I'm thinking to myself, what does influence with respect look like when you look around the board and you decide to see the value that everyone's bringing to the table.
I think partly it's having established relationships with other board members. A great thing is to listen, really get to know your fellow board members outside. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone. I know you can send an email or a text or go on Instagram or yada yada. Get on a phone, spend 15 minutes. Yeah, oh, I heard you talk about your son's graduation. How is that going? Did he find a job yet? I mean, these are human contacts. And the organism of boardrooms works more smoothly, especially in times of stress, when those people in the room really know each other.
Yeah.
They really, they know beyond the resumes. They know beyond the fact that you're an expert in artificial intelligence. They know other things about you. And it's very helpful. It's very, very helpful. I mean, when we were going through the terrible time that we had going from Syms, the retail store, through the reorganization and becoming a real estate company and really losing, the only thing I wanted to make sure was that all of our coworkers who had pensions got their pensions, that they were helped in getting other jobs. But because the board members knew me so well, they knew that that was going to be my priority. My priority was to make sure that this entity remained a place that people could trade their shares, which it did, stayed on the NASDAQ,
Huh.
that it remained a place that respected the time and the work done by our coworkers and gave them their rightful pensions, and it did.
Wow.
And we gave our clothing vendors 100 cents on the dollar on anything that we owed. Anything. That was the most important thing. So I figured out at the beginning what was most important to me.
Yeah.
Getting through this nightmare. That
Yeah.
was
Not many people go through a chapter 11 and make as many people whole as you all did.
That's
And that
correct.
clearly comes from the ethos of respect you have for all of your stakeholders.
Correct. Correct. And what you're willing to sacrifice yourself. I mean, it doesn't come without a price.
Fair. That's very fair. That's very fair. So I'm curious, like you mentioned that this sort of the idea of this book started as, you know, preserving and expanding the story of your father and your family. Tell me more about like the emergence of respect as a primary value in as a philosophy of leadership, and what do you feel like everyone who's listening should know? You know, if we're going to download as much of your wisdom and knowledge about this, how can we make it simple and clear and actionable for people to start leading with respect?
If you want to be heard, you have to listen. That's the number one rule. If you want to be seen, you have to see. If you want someone to make time for you, you have to make time for them. It almost sounds a little bit like going back to the biblical. Well, actually, it's every religion.
Sure.
Treat others as you would like to be treated.
Right, but go first. It seems like you're saying that
I'm
in a way it's up to you to set the tone for the kinds of conversations you want to be having, the kinds of relationships you want to be having
correct.
by bringing that value and that mindset in early and often and not necessarily waiting for the other person to go first.
That's right. That's right. And that takes a certain amount of centeredness. I think,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but it's
Why not? We can do whatever we want here.
okay. Well, philosophically, it's kind of like meditating. It's kind of like, you're finding your center, you're finding your And so if someone comes at you, you can them out and really dumb questions like, I hear you. Where are you coming from? I really want to understand. Where is that coming from? What was your experience? Why was that your takeaway? Because I didn't get the same thing. I'm not saying yours wasn't legit. I'm just
Mhm.
saying I would like to understand it. And that kind of maturity, I can call that maturity respect. And there are
Mhm.
those kinds of, respect is something that is a habit
Mhm.
because it has to be your default behavior. When you're under stress, when you're attacked, when you feel insecure, respect has to be your default behavior.
Yeah.
It's powerful. It's powerful.
So, I mean, it's clear that there's an inner game of
Yes.
respect as
Yes.
well. Like it's not always easy in these moments. You know, sometimes I like to say that nobody has a conversation thermometer. One has not been invented, it doesn't exist. But we all know when the conversation's getting hot, and it can be tempting to do things that will increase the temperature of the conversation. And one of the things I hear you talking about is like respect is this cooling of the conversation. It really keeps it at this human level. It keeps it at the level of relationship and creating the kind of relationship that you want to continue with. As my
Well,
mother would
let
say,
me ask
start
you,
as you mean to continue. Yeah, sorry,
and
please go
let me
ahead.
ask you a question.
Sure.
Do you know when you're being disrespected?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. One of the things that I think is it's easy to tell yourself the story that you're being disrespected.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I think sometimes I like to just tell myself the story, well, they're just having a hard time
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
here.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they're having a moment. So
Or it's like
I can feel that. You
or
sure?
the person who cuts you off at the exit. And of course you
Exactly.
say in your mind, you go, oh, they're probably doing this because one of their relatives they just found out is in the emergency room, so that you don't get totally pissed off. And
Right, right. It's a
you don't
classic
try to
retelling.
right. You kind of retell it. I do think that's really an interesting point though. If your temperature is already high, is your interpretation of disrespect something that's going to work against you? And that's why I call it a habit.
Uh,
That's why it constantly takes practice because you need to have the ability to measure that in different settings, in different situations,
yeah.
eliciting different responses in you.
Yeah.
But I think we all know when we're feeling respected.
Yes, that is harder to say. Right, and so say more a little bit about that, knowing that feeling for yourself, but also intentionally creating that feeling for other people.
Yes. Okay. Um, let's do an example, intentionally creating. You have someone coming over to visit you and you're late. They were supposed to come over for dinner and you didn't have time to go shopping. And not only that, you have an 8 o'clock Zoom call. So you can't even hang around and chat over coffee. Well, my goodness. That person, if they ever talk to you again, unless this is like a member of the family, you expect to have this person ever want to be in your presence again? I think that's delusional. So you know what the bricks of being respected are because you know how you would want to be treated yourself. Now, in
Hmm.
a work setting, that is much broadly appreciated and understood. There are things like following the rules about vacations, understanding that when you have meetings, you give people the agenda beforehand. You ask them if they have anything to add. How are things going in their part of the business? How about having new hires speak? What's your first impressions? How are things working for you? We value you as a new member of the community. Help us get better. Being asked for your opinion is a huge part of respect.
Oh,
And being asked how you're feeling is even a deeper part of respect.
yeah.
So I think that it's not, we started at Sims because my dad really had this attitude towards every person who walks into the store is spending their hard earned money with us. We have to respect their time. We have to respect their intelligence. We have to respect the fact that they have choices.
Uh-huh.
And we have to respect the fact that it will be based on their good experience that we're going to be able to grow this company.
Huh.
So all of those things were, as I said earlier, fundamentally foundational
Yeah.
to how we looked at the world. And I think in the world of retail, it's the same today. It's not any
Yes.
different. People haven't changed. We really haven't. I think we hide more because the world lets us hide more. You know,
Yeah.
we can be out there and be very talkative in an anonymous way, but we haven't changed as human beings. We're the same.
Yeah. I want to unpack a couple of things there,
Sure.
Marcy, because you use this phrase, the bricks of respect, which and it's clear that it's something that is uh, established, put together, constructed over time. And
Yes.
you highlighted a couple of things, and one is a classic group dynamics um, ingredient, which is that, like, if everyone in the room is there, then why aren't we hearing from them? It can be the job of the leader to make sure that everyone feels like their contribution is worthwhile, and to ask for it, and to pull everybody in to that
But if you
conversation.
want to institutionalize that, it can actually not just be on the leader. It could be actually the rules of engagement.
Yeah.
We went to, it was a very expensive thing to do, but critical to the culture. We had in-person management meetings, and that meant that all of the people who were in top management in all the stores would get together in person at least 4 times a year and would stay overnight, and they'd have dinner together and da 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 da, because we wanted them to learn from each other. Was there someone in Cleveland who could learn something from
Uh-huh.
someone from Washington, D.C., in their customers being different? And what could that learning, and what could we at the top of the pyramid, what could we learn? And that became a very important brick for us, those in-person exchanges. And then we would write up those in-person exchanges. And guess what? You didn't have to be someone from central office. You had something that you wanted to write that needed to be included, send it. There was always an open door policy. I know this sounds so ridiculous now because people aren't in the office that much, but you can have an open door policy on email. You can have an open door policy on any other internal system of technology.
Yeah.
It's like having a rule that you must be answered within 2 hours. That's like having an open door policy.
Yeah. And I can see how each of these rules or guidelines can be seen as a form of respect. Right? If
Yes.
somebody is reaching out to you, it's just a form of respect to actually respond to them in a reasonable amount of time. We can't
Well, you
expect
can,
that
to look at those
all
bricks,
communications will be
we
responded
talk
to all
about
the
the
time
bricks.
forever.
Yeah. The bricks of that is look at your organization. What areas are needed to create a culture? What areas do we need to have a conscious, deliberate, and determinative action to create the culture we want? That would be an exercise that would be worthwhile for everyone who's making decisions in your organization to do. And the commitment, you really, I mean, that's a word that's used a lot these days, but what could be more important than making a commitment to have respect as an important part of your culture?
Well, so can we go back to the moment when you feel like you're being disrespected, right?
Yes.
Because this is clearly the moment when it's most critical to find that reserve in yourself, to make it your meditation, your practice. I'm sure there's been many times, you mentioned this in your book several times, like being the only woman in the room. You got a lot of disrespect for I assume over an extended period of time. I know many people listening here have sort of forgotten that there was a period of time when, you know, people were like, "Can a woman even blank?" Like fill in,
Right,
but
right,
you were there, and it's so how did you find that reserve of respect when you were being disrespected, because it's not trivial to do.
right. Well, you do have to separate the action from the person in order to find your way back to an appropriate way to behave. I know it sounds like mumbo jumbo, but
No,
really
no.
it's really important. I mean, I had a specific experience working at Sims when I was CEO where I had uncovered, unfortunately, I would have been better off not knowing, but I had uncovered that there were these rumors circulating kind of about me that were completely not true. And I had to figure out the person who brought me this information. Number one, we had to talk about what he thought was the reason that this started, what his recommendations might be, who he
Mm,
thought it might be best for me to speak to. And then, in order for me to behave in a way that wasn't overly emotional, or
mm,
kind of in many respects sometimes destructive in and of itself because it's an overreaction, to separate the people who were saying this from the origin and the intent. So there
mm,
are two things here. Why was it created? Number one, and what was the person's? And in repeating this misinformation, boy, this sounds very topical. Repeating this misinformation, what was the intent of the people who kept um, the whispering going?
mm,
And there mustn't have been any really understanding of separating that from weakening the company, weakening me, disrupting management, and all that. And I found that the best way to deal with that was actually to take it on as what I did was to take it on not in a direct way, except for the person who told me about it, because they very much were vested in this. They
mm,
cared deeply and were hurt by it. They were outraged by it.
mm,
But I decided to take it kind of in a side way and to um, nullify it by doing something else. It's kind of like if you go out with people, they have this thing that you're only a vegan, and you go out with people and you order a hamburger. You know what I mean? It kind
mm,
of upsets their whole equilibrium about how they categorized you. So
mm,
I chose to go about dealing with it by doing something unexpected, that
mm.
people would have to change their view of me because she did that.
Yeah.
Oh, then she probably didn't do the other thing.
Mm,
And that's just one way of going about it. But it's a good thing not to be impulsive.
sure, sure. I agree. I
or
agree.
as or as my shrink told me after I joined the family business, I figured I'd better get some help because this emotional stuff is just too complicated. And my shrink told me, you have to be really on guard about what your expectations are about
Mm,
people's behavior. Don't
yeah.
drive the car around your expectations. Drive it within the lines of the real road.
Mm. Mm. So there's so many threads that I want to pull on. I want to come back to how you as a leader help yourself, but I want to just put a pin in that because I want to just peel a couple of layers of the onion.
Sure.
One is this idea of changing the conversation. not by leading or going straight at the thing, but by just in a way like pouring clean water into a muddy cup. It's like, I'm
Yes.
just going to pour some clean water into this. And that's a very different way of counteracting the narrative and to change the narrative, not through saying, oh, well, I'm not this or I didn't do that, is very different than just doing something and different and letting
Yes.
people see from that.
Yes. Yes. And it really does take thought and planning and knowing your audience and having a really good grasp of reality to understand what the outcome might be, the outcome
Hmm.
you want, and what outcomes might be that you don't expect. To do something like that, you need to also go through the collateral damage issue. I mean, it was, I think, Eisenhower who said that plans are dispensable, but planning is indispensable.
Hmm.
And that is so, so, so true. You always need to be planning, especially if you're in a leadership position, because every single thing you do takes a ripple effect in
Yeah.
your organization. Every single thing you do. You get a new car, you change your shoe brand, you now those are all things you see. You change, the platform you're communicating on. Everything you do has ripple
Communicates.
effects. Yeah.
Yeah. So the other thing that I want to just sort of like highlight, this was a principle that one of my mentors taught me about years ago, which is in a way always respecting yourself. It
Yes.
sounds like you're really making decisions many times in how you respond to someone in a way that responding to disrespect in a way that creates a bigger mishigas versus handling in a way that respects yourself, that
Yes.
does it in a way that creates what you really want to accomplish, not
You
more
know,
noise,
when
but the next thing.
outside of the work environment, but when I was a caregiver, I had the responsibility of taking care at end of life two of my siblings. It was just a unusual kind of situation, and as a caregiver, you're not usually respected. You go into a hospital or you go into a facility and stuff, and you ask for something and you try to be nice and you try to figure out how busy their day is, and you don't get an answer for 2 hours, 3 hours. The person leaves their shift and you don't, so the way to get around with that, to use one of your kind of more New Yorky expressions, is to schmear them. And you can schmear them with something as simple as bringing in a bagel and lox sandwich
Uh,
and saying, I saw that you had to cut your lunch short yesterday. Oh, that I really felt for you. I wanted to share my lunch. I brought you something, and just having that experience is another way to put people in uncharted territory.
uh-huh.
Believe me, they don't expect that to happen to them. They don't expect the irate relative who they
Yeah,
never got to answer the day before to come in with a lot for them.
sure.
You
And
know,
if,
and I feel a little bit like, the what a wonderful world it would be
uh,
if instead of always raising the temperature, there was a way to say, okay, here's a schmear.
yeah, that's a way to reset the conversation and to say
Again,
like, look, this is not
yes.
personal. I know you're really busy.
Right, right, right.
So one other thing I want to highlight before, I know we only have it's shocking the time goes fast. You mentioned YPO. I've been lucky enough to
Yes.
do some work with some YPO forums, and I'm a big believer in forums. You also mentioned therapy, and I'm a big believer that, in a way, a stool can have as many legs as it needs to be as stable as possible. And
Mm.
I'm curious if you can talk about the ways in which you supported and nourished and took care of yourself as a leader. I mean, you mentioned some ways that forums worked for you and how hard it was to find a forum that really did support you in the book. What are the things that you feel like helped you nourish yourself and sustain yourself as a leader through all these ups and downs that you lived through?
Well, I'm talking to you now having learned a lot because I did a lot that I probably wouldn't do exactly the same. I would not, I was available 24/7 in a family business, working with a dad and brothers and sisters, and I was always available, and it was very hard to maintain and keep boundaries.
Mm,
One of the things that made me leave one YPO group and go to another was actually being the only woman in the forum group and
mm,
thinking I'm always explaining what their experience is. And I'm not sure I have any take home value here. I mean, it's
mm,
nice to feel that how you interpret their problem with their female HR director or their new female admin. Yes, it's nice that I can do that. But what am I getting out of that? So I went to another forum, but truthfully, YPO forums, as much as I wanted to get something out of it, it wasn't until I joined an organization a few years later called the Committee of 200, which was for women entrepreneurs. When
mhm,
I helped we started a very similar structure. We called them councils.
mhm,
And it was getting together in regions very similar, where we would have a plot line, and you would get together once a month and you could follow the plot line of the members of the council. And because you had the plot line, you could come in and have an opinion about when things go off the skids
mm,
and be helpful. And I actually found that in terms of councils and forums, that was more helpful to me.
mhm,
That without having to go through 3 paragraphs or backstories, I could say, and then when they got to this, they forgot
mhm,
all about that and they went to this and they forgot that I had said that and they went to something else. And I had to work hard to re-steer the conversation back to where it was. And they just got it right away.
mhm.
They just immediately got it because that's what happens to women in the room,
Yeah.
you know, and uh, not as much now, but certainly still. And so I would say, and YPO, I know because I'm still a member. I'm a gold, and I'm an at large, and I love the organization, what the intent of the organization is. But the Committee of 200, the Women's Forum, the International Women's Forum, some of the groups, I started a group myself with a friend of mine who is an expert in family business called Daughters of Bosses, and that only lasted a few years because women of the age of building their careers are also building families.
Yeah.
And they have to wake up at 4:30 in the morning to work out. So it's really hard for them to be members of organizations beyond that and to have,
Mhm,
a career and be planning their career advancement. So it's the whole structure of YPO looks at things, and it's kind of just jumping to another thing uh, I had been reading about, and then I saw in 60 Minutes this whole field of freezing eggs, and that women are in their 30s and 40s, early 40s, are freezing their eggs if they don't have. And one woman, she was a professor from Harvard, and I thought she was brilliant. She said, yeah, it's great, but it doesn't always work when you get to it, and you might not have enough eggs when you get to it. And the best time to have kids is when you're in your 20s, and it's better for the kids when you're in your late 20s than it is when you're in your late 30s. And wouldn't it just be easier if we had universal daycare?
sure. Nice work if you can get it, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's there's an answer with the whole idea that we know now that women in groups, that if you have 10 people, in order for women to actually feel free to make contributions, has to be about 30%. So 3 out of 10.
Uh-huh.
And I live that. I live that on boards.
Yeah. So one thing I just want to pull, one thread I want to pull on is the importance of a group that holds the plot. Right. So I'm
Yes.
assuming that even though the committee was of 200, you were in a group that was a lot smaller. I know in
Oh,
YPO
yes.
it's,
About
you know,
10.
it's 5 to
About,
say, yeah, about 10. And
yeah,
you're meeting with these people. And not everyone knows the sort of the essential ingredients of forum. These 10 people, you're meeting with them once a month, come hell or high water. And
correct.
that's why they know the plot, because
Correct.
they can hold space for you. The other thing that you're talking about, which seems really important, is it's sort of the flip side of holding the plot. You can't be constantly explaining the fundamentals. And certainly when the bell curve in the room is more men than women, and maybe a certain type of man who needs these things explained to them, it really inhibits the ability for you to get the kind of support that you need. But I do want to make it clear from your book, it is clear that being in these groups over years is like a really foundational kind of support, that these people get it and they help normalize the challenges that you're going through, which are uh, multifarious.
Listen, it's a certain kind of a person who's a joiner to begin with. It's a certain kind of a person who's willing to share their plot. It's tedious and it can be painful, especially when things are not going as you told everyone you wanted it to go.
Mm-hmm.
You're
Mm-hmm.
explaining that no, indeed, it went that way, even though I prepared for that way.
Right.
And there's a shared appreciation, and that shared appreciation is really what makes it possible. If you want to call that respecting, also one of the things in the groups that I think is telling is how much of what you've shared in your plot is remembered. Because you say, Daniel, you don't want to keep going over it, because when are you going to get something out of it? And that's why you don't have new members all the time. That's
Mm-hmm.
why it's a certain limited number of absentee. Um, it can work. But I don't think that forum should be therapy.
Mm.
That you should do that work on your own. I'll never forget. It was a organization, a not for profit, that I was actually the board chair for a time, and this individual who was very integral to the organization was being very disrespectful and very rough to people. And someone influential in the organization took me aside and said, she had a really bad relationship with her father. And I'm sorry, I said, that's what therapy's for. We are not here to help her work out her issues with her dad.
Yeah.
And I say the same thing for councils or YPO group. You're not a therapist. It's a very different process.
Yeah. Yeah, and personally, in my own experience, when I'm working with a CEO client that I'm coaching, I'm grateful when they're in a forum and when they have a therapist, because then we
Yes.
can do the other things.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Someone who is that curious about their own evolution, about their own development. Oh, that's a gift. Really, it's a gift to the person because they will grow.
Yeah.
And when they're curious enough to get that support from professionals, that doesn't mean a crutch. I don't believe
No.
that it's not Nancy Reagan and I have to talk to my astrologer before we make a decision. This is giving yourself the skills and the practice
Mm.
to be present enough to be a useful member of a council and to get the most out of advice.
Mm. Yeah. So speaking of respect, I want to respect your time. I really appreciate you being willing to sit down with me and share the message of your book and the work you've done. With the moments we have left, what haven't we talked about that what else is there that is important to share about respect? What are your parting words, the billboard that we should put up if you want everyone to drive by? Like, how should we land this conversation?
Well, if you want to get more respect, you have to give more respect. But perhaps the parting word has nothing to do necessarily with my personal experience, but has to do with my experience as a woman living in America. I
Mm.
worked for the last 15 years for the passage of the ERA. And I believe that not having women recognized as equal under the law in our Constitution, our federal Constitution, is so disrespectful. To this day, it gets the hairs on the back of my neck to rise up because it is the ultimate sign of disrespect not to be recognized in a place that you love, you work hard for, and that you're making a contribution. So we need, I hope to live to see. I know when I was working with the ERA Coalition and now the ERA Project, talking to younger women, and they say, well, when do you think we'll get it done? And I always used to say, oh, I hope before I die. And they go, oh, come on, it'll happen before then. I said, just before, I just like it before I die. That's all. That's all. And that to me, as understanding how it feels to be part of a group,
Mm.
imagine you're part of this country paying taxes, working hard, believing in the military, running for office, doing whatever needs to be done to make this country great. And you're not in the Constitution. Think about that.
I think that's a really great place to land. I mean, it's a fundamental sign of respect, as you said,
Yeah.
to include people deeply.
Yes.
And boy, well, as my folks would say, from your mouth to God's ears. I hope you get many years to enjoy that being part of our Constitution. And
I hope we all
I'm really
do.
glad that you're
Yes.
working on that. That's extraordinary work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Obviously, people can find your book on Amazon, wherever fine books are sold. Is there any other place that you'd like to send them to learn about all things Marcy Syms on the
Well,
internet?
I do have a website and marcysyms.com. I would like to ask people if they have the chance to write a review on Amazon. You know, the last time I had a book out, it was about family business, and it was in 1992, and there were no Amazon reviews. But I'm hearing from my publisher, Kensington, a third generation family publisher, that the way to do it now is to be reviewed on Amazon. So I
100%
would
true.
like to ask that if you can, just a one sentence review would be fine. Just don't, if you can't say anything good, don't say anything at all.
That's 100% agree. But it is really a lovely story. It's a beautiful book. I'm really glad that you wrote it, and I'm really happy to share it with everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a delight.
Thank
Thank
you. I
you.
appreciate that.